mean, we've been talking about this for the last one and a half months, and Kenya will be the host of this 59th edition of the African Development Bank's annual general meeting. This meeting is taking place at Kenyatta International Convention Center. Critical issues are going to be discussed on how to restructure the global financial architecture as well as replenish the African Development Bank. Joining us on this week's episode of Inside Government, we are joined by Dr. Chris Kipto. He's a Principal Secretary in the State Department of National Treasury. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here. First of all, help us understand, how critical is this meeting to us as Kenyans?
In the next 10 days, we will be hosting the 59th meeting of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank Group. And this is a meeting that takes place every year for those members of the African Development Bank. So this year we got the opportunity as Kenya to host the 59th meeting of the African Development Bank Group and also the 50th meeting of the African Development Fund Group. Most people might not know the difference, but the African Development Bank Group has a number of windows: concessional window, commercial window, and grant window. So for commercial window, we have the African Development Bank, and the Board of Governors will be holding the 59th meeting. For the concessional window, we have the African Development Fund Board of Governors meeting, which will be holding its 50th meeting here in Nairobi. So it will be a combined meeting that will bring together the governors, because the governors of the bank are the ministers of finance and also their alternates. And a number of heads of state from Africa have been invited, and also multilateral and bilateral agencies, development agencies have been invited. Private sector will also be part of it, academia, and the civil society. And it will be a 5-day event starting from May 27th, which is Monday, to Friday, May 31st. Yeah. And in these 5 days, it's going to focus a lot on conversation around the architecture, financial architecture, that needs to be restructured in order to free more resources to support particularly the key stakeholders of the African Development Bank, who are their members, who are the African countries. So the way this event has been organized, that there will be a presidential segment, because we have heads of state and government joining. Our president, William Ruto, will be the main host, just like he did for the IDA 21 in end of April, which he pulled out a very successful event that brought together several leaders. This time again, we have another opportunity to host a number of African heads of state and government in this discussion around reforming the financial architecture within the world. And this is not just focusing about ADB, focusing about World Bank, IMF, international architecture, to see how we can it can support countries such as Africa that are really, because of the risk nature of the way Africa is viewed, it's costing the financial cost is very high in terms of debt that it pays. Africa, I think I said earlier, is that we have an average. Africa has about $640 billion worth of debt that it has to pay. These are
expensive debts.
Very expensive debts.
Borrowed
at commercial rates. Some are, of course, at multilateral, at commercial rates. But overall, interest payments are around $70 billion on average per year. That's a lot of money. 9 trillion Kenya shillings. And really, the fiscal space for most African countries is not there. For Kenya, for instance, we pay an average of 28 to 30% of our own revenues as interest payments for debt. That's a huge amount. It means for every 10 shillings that we get, 3 shillings is going to be used to pay interest. And so really, we need to look at how to restructure or reorganize the financial architecture in order to be able to make it easier or less burdensome for most of the African countries, so that they can still be able to get resources to finance the many development needs that it has.
And the reason why, Africa ends up paying a premium, for the loans it takes is because of its perceived risk profile. And unfortunately, the rating agencies are all from the West. There has been a conversation on how to set up an African-oriented rating agency. Is this conversation likely to come up during the meeting?
I believe this is part of the whole discussion around ensuring that there is fairness and equity in treatment of everyone within the global arena. And especially for African countries, we know we are suffering a lot because of climate change effects. And yet we play very minimal role when it comes to emission levels.
It's about 4%.
About 4%. Yet it bears the biggest impact of climate change. Most of the resources have to be used, most of the resources that African countries have to be used to either address drought emergencies or flood emergencies. And really, this is why there should be a discussion, because the heavy polluters are the ones responsible. So, and yet they're the ones also lending to African countries very expensively, when actually the discussion should be around and making it easier, because most African countries are the culprits. And really, that discussion for need to look at that architecture is why we need to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And for us, I think we take this very seriously, because ADB has been an important partner. We just got approval in December last year for a new cycle of funding from ADB, which is for about $4 billion, just about $500 billion Kenya shillings, which will be funding for between 2024 to 2028, supporting Kenya. Mm-hmm. So far, about 37% of the funding from ADB has gone to transport, particularly to support our road network. Yeah. Another 20% has gone to water and sanitation. Another 17% has gone to energy sector. Another 13% has gone to the financial sector. And agriculture is around 7%. Mm-hmm. About 2% of resources we get from the African Development Bank goes to support governance-related areas. So so for us, a conversation on additional funding is important, because we really have huge development needs that require a lot of resources.
One of the most critical, actually I'll quote two, one of the two of the most critical infrastructural projects, ever bankrolled by African Development Bank. One of them is a last mile connectivity, and also the construction of thicker roads, the thicker superhighways. Do we have other projects that you can quote that have been financed by the bank?
Yeah, I think one of them is the Twaka Dam, for instance, in Kitui, which is a big project. We also have a number of road projects, several of them, like the Mombasa bypass, for instance. Within Mombasa, several projects. In the Western Kenya, we have a lot of roads and a number of energy-related projects that within the geothermal sector, we have support from ADB. So it is in several sectors, as I've said: road sector, energy sector, and of course, financial sector. And then we have also the agriculture sector, because we have also had a lot of support from the African Development Bank to support. Even on our the fertilizer program, last year we got support from the same bank to support our fertilizer subsidy, which I think those resources came in and really supported us in ensuring that we supply sufficient amount of fertilizer for our farmers.
Mm-hmm. And so it is proper to say that the bank has been a critical cog in Kenya's development agenda over the years.
Yes, and we are happy that we are hosting again. This will be the fourth time that Kenya will be hosting this event. The first time we hosted was in 1968. The second was in 1983, I think, and the third one was in 1994. So we are lucky again to have it this time, the fourth time, after 30 years. Just to say that we have put in sufficient resources. We have ensured that all adequate preparations have been met in terms of protocols, security arrangements, and hosting the event is important for us, because it's going to benefit us. All the hotels in Nairobi will benefit from having to host the visitors. And of course, there are what we say multiply effects of those, because it means our farmers will be able to support food to this, our tourism sector. Those who will be here will also be able to sample a few of our tourist features. So I think conferencing is one of those niches for Kenya, and we will continue to build that leadership as we go forward.
Look, during the last replenishment of the bank, that was in 2022, a historic record was set of $8.9 billion US, was pledged towards to support the bank. And President William Ruto has been very critical in saying that it is high time we ramped up this figure in the 17th replenishment, which is coming up in 2025. And he's been talking about a figure of $25 billion. I mean, what do we need to do to achieve this number?
I think it is more, this is why we have this conversation for 5 days. It is really to demonstrate the need, the justification, why we need more resources, particularly African countries. And look, we have faced multiple shocks. They are external to us. We faced the COVID-19, the Ukrainian war, even now the crisis in the Middle East, which have led to increase in commodity prices, leading to high inflation, and that the pass-through effects have impacted on our most exchange rates in African countries have weakened, leading to further worsening of debt servicing for most African countries. And the revenues, the fiscal position for most African countries is not that good, given that they also have to respond to challenges that are not of their making, which is also on climate change. So there is every reason to really argue for more resources. And it's not just more resources. It should be resources that African countries can afford, which is why we are saying more concessional financing. And this is why we are just continuing with the conversation we had with the World Bank through IDA 21, where we were saying we need more replenishment of more concessional financing. The same thing also here, we are talking about funding the African group, probably supporting more the concessional window, which is the ADF, and even putting in a number of grant elements. Because we see also a lot of climate finance that come in is for mitigation and not for adaptation. And most of what goes to mitigation is by way of loans and not grants. Yet really, I think countries that have very little to do with the impacts of climate change should really be supported by way of more concessional financing, as required and as agreed under Paris Agreement. So this is the conversation. It is a conversation that will continue, but I think our president has done very well and is providing that leadership even as he travels abroad. He keeps really hammering this point that we really need to see how to reform the international financial architecture. Both the IMF, World Bank, the African Development Bank Group, and others. That's why also we are now beginning to join the Africa Finance Corporation. We are joining the European Investment Bank as a shareholder. We also want to join the Asian Investment Bank so that we leverage on all these resources for our country.
And this meeting is coming at a critical time, when Kenya, has faced a number of shocks. We started with the severe drought that we went through. First of all, it was COVID-19, then there was a major drought, record-breaking drought, and now we went through a serious flooding. And so do you expect this kind of conversation, or what kind of message will Kenya be passing across to the delegates in regard to what has happened?
We are going to be passing the message, especially of the fact that our economies are ravaging from impacts of climate change. We have just gone through huge, serious flooding, heavy flooding, which have destroyed our infrastructure, estimated now at around 30 billion, and we have not even finished assessing. We just came out of a long, prolonged drought period, and really we are saying our fiscal space is really tightening, and tightening in the sense that we have less and less of monies available for critical development initiatives. So we really need to meet, and these meetings will help us now to really focus around more financing and really talking about particularly those well-developed countries that have resources for them to be able to give us more. And not just to give us more, but at concessional terms.
Also, then another issue that is likely to come up, for for conversation is the ownership and the, the structure of the bank. You put it too well. 54 countries in Africa, they own, shares in the bank, and then you have about 27, other outside players like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, among others. Is it high time that we relook at the structure of ownership of this bank to make it more African?
I think it is more about African countries working hard to put more subscription shares into the bank, because it is our bank. It is the bank for African countries. But I think, given the situations that we are in, I think we're asking for others to come in. But even when they come in, they should invest and be able to still make it easier for the bank to provide more resources, but at much more concessional terms, so that most African countries can make use of those resources to meet their development requirements.
Mm-hmm. Because when you look at, for example, the top 5 shareholders of this bank, you have Nigeria as number 1. Then you have United States at number 2, you have Japan at number 3, you have China. So how can we claim that this is our bank? When
I think the fact that it's African is good, we are proud of it, but it doesn't have to be African bank to serve Africa. Just like most African countries have also joined Asia Development Bank, European Development Bank. I think the important thing is that we leverage on the resources available for supporting the development needs for Africa. So I think maybe the conversation coming up should be around more subscription by African countries. Because it's not like there is any restriction in terms of how much you put. It really depends on how much you are able to raise and contribute, to increase your share capital.
And also talking about contribution, look at Kenya. I mean, in terms of ownership or shareholding in the bank, we are rated at number 8. Are we making more efforts, probably, maybe to trounce the US and become number 2 after Nigeria?
You see, we would not mind being number 1, but we can't just be at number 1, when we are not able to. So we are looking at the resources we have and incrementally adding as and when our fiscal space allows us to add more. Remember, even when we add more, we can't borrow the much we want because there is a limit to how much we can borrow, given the tight fiscal space. We have debt sustainability analysis that we have to undertake, and we need to make sure that we don't take more than we are able to pay. So really, we are looking at all this, the importance of increasing more capital, but also our capacity to take more debt. And I think that's the conversation we shall continue having.
Very good. As we come to the end of this interview, I also want to hear from you. When you look at Kenya, it has been, consistent when it comes to repaying its loans, from the bank. And when you go through the strategic plan that, the bank launched that runs from 2023 to 2028, it talks about deepening more investment in Kenya. Are there areas that Kenya is likely to sit down with the bank and make more requests for funding?
We want to see more funding to water and sanitation because in response to climate change effects, we need to see that when we have a lot of floods, we're able to construct more dams so that we build more storage of water instead of allowing it to just pass through. So our key focus is going to be on water storage, water and irrigation, and then also our road infrastructure. We still have deficits when it comes to road infrastructure. Most of our roads are not yet paved, so we still want to pave most of our roads. And we also want to focus more on agriculture to support the bottom-up economic transformation. And I think that is the discussion around that we're having now as we look at future funding going forward. But I think mitigation and adaptation of climate change is critical for us. So any funding that helps us to mitigate and to adapt to climate change, that would really be good. And I think this ADB funding is very handy for this case.
Any proposal for President William Ruto's signature project of affordable housing that you're likely to float?
Yes, of course, affordable housing is important, and it will form part of the discussion. But I think in his view, I see the president more focused around food security and around in irrigation, ensuring that we focus on getting resources to support, to ensure that we build resilience in the area of agriculture, and especially with the water being provided to our people so that they can be able to do irrigation and therefore enhance security. That's, of course, one area I have seen him focus on, particularly from the African Development Bank. And this is the message he has given us to say, please discuss, see if we can see more funding towards the water and irrigation sector so that we focus on food security.
What is your final remarks to Kenyans watching this program in regard to the upcoming meeting?
Just to tell Kenyans that we are ready to host this event logistically. We are ready to provide security to our visitors, and let's provide the usual welcome to our visitors in the usual tradition of Karibu Kenya. And we continue to carve this niche as making Nairobi an important destination area for conferencing. Tuko tayari. Asante sana.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. PS, for joining us on Inside Government.
Asante sana.
You see, Tuko tayari is the message from the Principal Secretary in charge of National Treasury. This is Dr. Chris Kiptoo. And I can also confirm that as Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, Tuko tayari to broadcast these events to Kenya, Africa, and the rest of the world. We'll be following up on these conversations and, of course, giving you more perspective. You have been watching Inside Government. Thank you for your time. Have a good afternoon.